Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. What makes a piece of music sexy? Because whatever it is, Careless Whisper has it. The opening saxophone riff has become practically synonymous with seduction, a clarion call for carnal passions. Which is ironic because when George Michael wrote it, that meaning couldn't have been further from his mind. To him, Careless Whisper was a confession, drawn from his own experience sleeping around as a teenager, and the lyrics explore the emptiness and regret he felt at having betrayed his lover's trust. So how did we get here? How did this anthem of pain become a cultural icon for pleasure? Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. And trust me, we're gonna talk about the saxophone, but first I want to put it into context by looking at the harmony. Careless Whisper uses what I like to call a mono loop, which means it's the same chord loop the entire time, in this case D minor, G minor, B flat, and A minor. And if you spend as much time thinking about chord loops as I have, this should immediately set off alarm bells. You see, I tend to think that the impact of a chord loop has a lot to do with how it uses its destinations. That is, chords that are approached by strong harmonic motion, but leave by weak motion. These draw your ears in, and they serve as anchors for the rest of the harmonic structure, but the only destination here is the G chord. That's the second chord in the loop, the weakest metric position. You just left home, and you're supposed to start the journey back, so a surprise destination buried in this spot destabilizes the whole thing. It doesn't feel like it wants to go anywhere. Of course, that's not to say you can't do it. After all, they did, and who am I to argue with Wham? But when I see an outgoing destination like this, the first thing I look for is some sort of stabilizing effect, some way to pull the structure back into a more expected shape, and fortunately for me and my pet theory, they gave me one. On the transition from G to B, and only that transition, there's a passing chord walking through A to turn this motion from a weak minor third into two stronger steps. You still get that subversive effect, like the harmony's trying to stop in the wrong place, but without losing all your momentum at once. And they also subvert the tonality in some more traditional ways. It's actually pretty unusual to end a loop on the 5 chord, at least once you move away from old school doo-wop forms. In modern loops, you're much more likely to see it end on the 4 or the flat 7, still strong ways to approach the roots, but without creating that very classical sounding 5-1 resolution. That resolution relies on the leading tone, the note a half step below the root of the key, creating this gravitational pull back home. It's also the major third of the 5 chord, so to avoid it, they instead use A minor, which has a C natural instead of that C sharp leading tone. This blunts the resolution, allowing for a more consistent motion throughout. It's a nice way of sneaking in that 5-1 chord motion without dealing with all its baggage. And to emphasize it further, they approach that A chord from B flat. B flat is the flat 6 of the key, sometimes called the minor leading tone. If you were following that whole negative harmony craze a couple years ago, this was the big revelation there. The flat 6 sits a half step above the 5th, so it has a similar gravitational pull downward, and you can get some pretty satisfying resolutions out of it. In fact, moving from flat 6 to 5 minor is the strongest resolution in the loop, but it's not pointed at the root, giving a somewhat similar effect to the outgoing destination. Once again, the chords are trying to stop in the wrong place. Taken together, this creates a pattern that feels tentative, uncomfortable, and unsure of itself, perfectly complementing Michael's lyrics about regretting the consequences of his careless choices. But let's come back to the saxophone. The reason I wanted to look at the chords first is that Steve Gregory is basically playing arpeggios. He's walking down each chord over and over, but not quite how you'd expect. There's some interesting choices here, and since this lick is by far the most iconic part of the song, I'd like to dissect it in a fair amount of detail, starting with the rhythm. He's using a really common pattern called... Okay, I don't actually know of a name for this pattern, but it feels like it should have a name. Let me know in the comments what I should call it. Anyway, it's a rhythm that's basically all eighth notes, starting on the downbeat, but somewhere along the way there's one rogue 16th that pulls all the other notes out of alignment, transforming them into syncopated offbeats for the rest of the bar. This technique of bouncing onto the offbeats and staying there is a great way of adding syncopation without creating a potentially destabilizing cross rhythm. If I smooth it out, You can see that most of the attacks are still the same length, but now it's extremely boring. The only other rhythmic flair comes on beat 3, where he holds one of the notes for slightly longer, momentarily pushing us back onto the beats, then drops another 16th to pull it back again. This one isn't as important to the overall feel, and if I remove it, you still get basically the same effect, but it does serve an important purpose, which brings us back to the arpeggios. Again, he's basically walking down each chord, but not quite. Like, the first bar is D minor 7, so we might expect something like this. But instead, he starts off on a high E. A non-chord tone played in a strong metric position like the downbeat is called an appoggiatura, and that rhythmic accent amplifies the inherent dissonance of the note by displacing the relatively consonant sound you'd expect to hear. Typically, appoggiaturas want to resolve by step to some sort of chord tone, and this lick does that, but this is why that extra 16th is so important. That shortened note is where he plays the D, so the root, well, technically there, gets bounced off very quickly to prevent the resolution from feeling complete. This lingering unsatisfied dissonance captures the uneasy pain of the song's protagonist, which becomes even more clear in the second half, where after walking all the way down to a low F, he jumps up a major 7 to hit that same E again, holding it for even longer this time to fully eclipse the D that briefly follows. Continuing through, the second bar again starts with an appoggiatura, this time playing the fourth of the chord, which is slightly more stable, sitting a whole step away from the chord tones on either side. But this new line is interesting in its own way. It's supposed to be a G minor 7 chord, but there's no G. He's arpeggiating a B-flat major triad, which, yes, all those notes are in G minor 7, but still. I think this is a product of the overall contour. If we just look at the first note in each bar, there's a nice slowly descending melody, basically walking down the scale to the fifth, but with that appoggiatura hiding the root. But while the first bar lets them bury the chord root on that 16th, if they wanted to do the same thing here, they'd need a drastic leap down. So if they can't do the bounce-off thing to de-emphasize the root, the next best option is to skip it entirely. The third bar, though, stands in sharp contrast in that it starts directly on the chord root, with no appoggiatura and no non-chord tones at all. I think this speaks to that leading tone thing I was talking about earlier. The point of this chord is to resolve to A minor, so prominently accenting the B flat helps point your ears in the right direction. But before we get to the A chord, I think it's time to talk about motivic development. I've mostly been describing the structure of the first bar, and he could have just repeated that pattern the whole time, but he didn't do that. Instead, he starts to dissolve the shape as he goes. In the first bar, he plays 2 full walks down the 4-note figure, while in the second, he drops the last pitch from the second walk. It's a subtle difference, but it sets up the much larger change coming next. In the third bar, he replaces the entire second walk with a single long held note an octave below where he started, giving you time to really hear that downward gravitational pull of the flat 6. This eventually releases into the final bar, a huge walk up an A Phrygian scale. This last bar is different in pretty much every imaginable way. Each of the first 3 lines had its own downward trajectory, and taken together they were also moving down on a larger scale, whereas this is obviously going pretty directly up. There's also no syncopation. All the rhythmic interest we talked about has been replaced with 8 even eighth notes. The phrase length is longer, too. The main figure was only 2 beats, and each chord got to play it twice, but here it takes an entire bar to complete the journey. And finally, the contour is different. The arpeggios were full of jumps and skips in order to cover the necessary range, but this is all moving in steps, giving it a harsher, more deliberate edge. This sharp, striking contrast makes it the perfect conclusion to the main figure, an unmistakable punctuation that leads us right back to the start. Except, about that start. This bar walks from low A to high A, setting up a really clear expectation that it's gonna leap back to the root for a strong, satisfying conclusion, but then, at the last second, oh yeah, The appoggiatura. Once again, an attempt to wrap things up with a neat little bow has been subverted at the last second as a clear musical tribute to the narrator's inescapable guilt. That's some good riff writing. Oh, and there's one other thing I want to say about the saxophone part. If you know about the history of this song, you probably know that Gregory was not the first person to record it. He said in interviews that he was the 9th session musician they tried, which seemed strange to me. As a non-saxophone player, I didn't think the line looked that hard. I wasn't sure why so many professional musicians would struggle with it, until I found a video by Dan Forshaw, who's worked with Gregory in the past, and had asked him that question. I'll put a link in the description for the full explanation, but in short, the culprit is this slide at the beginning. Now, the saxophone isn't a trombone. It's not a guitar. It can't actually slide. If I slow this down, you can hear that it's actually a pentatonic run of distinct pitches played extremely fast. But Gregory quickly realized that in order to play it clean, he'd need an F-sharp key. This is an extra button some saxophones have that, from the performer's perspective, lets you play a high F-sharp. That's not actually the note that comes out, but I don't have time to get into the bizarre world of saxophone notation right now. Point is, he needed one, but his sax didn't have one, so he had to do some fancy finger work to hit the notes, and at that speed it sounded sloppy. Fortunately, he had a trick. He asked producer Chris Porter to slow the track down a bit, just enough to lower the pitch by a half step. He recorded in that key, then sped it back up to make it sound higher. This had 3 main advantages. First, it meant he didn't need the F-sharp anymore. All the notes fit comfortably on his instrument, letting him rip through it much more efficiently. Second, a slower tempo meant he could play more precisely, resulting in a really smooth take once it was sped back up. Personally, I think this is probably the most important factor. A lot of the previous takes were rejected for not sounding fluid enough, and the slower tempo gave him a little more space to breathe. And third, it changed the timbre. Tenor saxophones have some lower, grittier harmonics to them, but speeding up the tape raised those as well, making it sound a bit like an alto, but also a bit artificial. And as Dan points out in his video, this was the 80s, and artificial sounds were in. Having a real saxophone that still sounded just a little bit synthesized gives the song a really unique, ethereal sort of vibe that captures the almost out-of-body experience the song is about. Which leads us back to the question from the intro. If all these parts fit so well with Michael's story of regret, why do so many people seem to hear something so much, well, hornier? It'd be easy to blame the audience, to say they're just not listening close enough to understand what he's really saying, but I think that misses a much more interesting point. Careless Whisper is a fascinating case study in the flexibility of musical imagery. That meandering, misdirected chord loop could represent Michael losing his connection to his partner, but it could also represent the awkward, hesitant excitement of a first kiss or a first other stuff. The appoggiatura-laden descending arpeggios might sound painful, but without getting too graphic, pain and pleasure are not necessarily opposites. And while the otherworldly timbre of the saxophone gives the song a detached, poignant edge, saxophones have long been associated with sexuality for a lot of reasons, not least of which is the name. So yeah, it might contradict the text in some places, but that reading is definitely there. And that's the point. Whenever you encounter a work of art, you bring your own life experiences with you, and you understand the components of that piece through a certain lens. If I choose to view it from Michael's perspective, I can find plenty of evidence to support a story of guilt, regret, and existential emptiness. But if I instead choose to view it from the perspective of the sexy saxman memes, that same evidence points me in a very different direction. And they're both valid. Art isn't just a thing someone makes and then you observe. The observation is what makes it art. The art object mediates a conversation between your life and the artist's. By experiencing the work, you become an active participant in its creation, and the things you take from that experience are true, even if they were never supposed to be there. So no, the celebration of carefree sex and the lifestyle of a serial Lothario is not what this song is about. But also, yes, it is. Art is complicated, and meaning is always emergent. But also, I don't think that meaning is a coincidence here. The reason this sounds so much like a sensual love song is because it is. The two stories aren't in conflict, they're just operating at different levels. After all, the passionate intimacy conveyed by the musical reading is the source of his regret in the more lyrically informed interpretation. Synthesizing the two perspectives lets us hear both what he's lost and why he's lost it, and it conveys his last-ditch effort to try to get it back. Plus, it avoids coming across as overly moralizing. Embracing the more seductive aspects of the music clarifies that the issue isn't really sexuality itself, it's the betrayal of trust. But okay, moving on. I know most of you clicked this video specifically for saxophone content, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't analyze the rest of the song too. Underneath this opening sax line is a rich, layered orchestration. At the bottom is Trevor Murrell laying down a fairly straightforward beat, accompanied by Danny Cummings on what sounds to me like congas. Murrell's part is pretty sparse, and it's also drenched in reverb, so it feels far away. In contrast, the conga line is closer, more dynamic, but also more relaxed. The hand percussion sound of a conga is a lot more chill than you get from hard wooden drumsticks. On beat 4 of each bar, there's also a tambourine hit, giving us an uneven backbeat. Murrell's playing a snare on 2 and 4 like we'd expect, but adding this extra thing just on 4 draws attention away from 2 and shifts it all toward the end of the bar, creating a subtle metric instability that gets resolved by the changing chord on the next downbeat. Speaking of which, the chords are being played on an electric piano by... Okay, I try to name the musicians where I can, but this song has 3 keyboardists credited, and I have no idea which of them played this part. It's either Chris Perrin, Andy Richards, or Ann Dudley. Point is, the prominent electric piano playing long, held pads gives the mix a beautifully soft, warm texture. Like with the percussion, this slow, open part is contrasted with a more active line, in this case guitar stabs by Hugh Burns, starting on an upbeat and hitting every 3rd 16th to create an interesting cross rhythm against the steady 4/4 groove. No one else is on this line, so Burns sits alone on his own metric layer, with stabs popping up in seemingly random spots relative to the beat to keep things interesting. And underneath that is Dion Estes on the bass, and the only thing I really want to highlight here is the register. The lowest note on a standard tuning bass is an E, so setting the song in D minor means the root sits about as high on the instrument as it goes. Compared to the rest of the progression, the D chord feels kind of unsupported, once again de-emphasizing the return to 1. That's gonna matter more once we get to the verse, where the energy of the piece seems to drop significantly. Which is interesting because not much has actually changed. Most of the parts carry through, so that drastic shift is mostly just replacing Gregory's piercing saxophone with Michael's soft-spoken vocals. But Estes does help out. On the first bar of each loop, he backs off even more, playing that high D so quietly that it almost sounds like he's laying out. He's not, it's still there, but while there are notes being played on a bass guitar, I think it's fair to say there's not actually a bass part supporting that first line. But okay, melody. At a glance, it doesn't seem like there's much in the way of structure. Each line is different from the last, giving it a free-flowing, through-composed sort of vibe. But looking closer, there is a single musical idea that ties it all together. A walk down from A, the 5th of the key, to D, the root. We see this most clearly stated in the first line, I feel so unsure, which is literally just that, sung with a slower version of that same rhythm we talked about in the saxophone. Most of the attacks are a quarter note long, starting on the downbeat, but the first one is cut short, pulling the rest of them onto offbeat eighths. The second line is a bit trickier. He starts the same walk down with a decorative B flat thrown in, then interrupts it to drop back to D before jumping up again and doing the walk down for real. As I take your hand and lead you to the dance floor. It's more elaborate, but in the end, he returns to the same motif. Although, you may have noticed he stops on E. This is a clever little sleight of hand. In this version of the line, he's not syncopating. He's just singing straight, on-beat quarter notes, and when you hear 5, 4, 3, 2 in such a strong rhythmic pattern, it sets you up to hear 1 on the next downbeat. And even though he doesn't sing it, that's where the chord goes, incorporating the harmony into the melodic structure. To the dance floor, It's cute. From there, he flips it and speeds up. Each line so far has been 2 bars long, but the next 2 are a single bar each, and instead of walking down, they walk up. Again, he starts by clearly spelling out the new shape, as the music dies, before doing a slight variation on it that winds up landing on the high B flat instead. Something in your eyes. This acceleration builds excitement for a final release, which we get in the last line. Here, he wavers back and forth between B flat and A for a bit before wrapping things up with one last big walk down the scale. Oh, it's sad. Goodbye. Landing again on D to close out the section. And that's interesting because the section kinda doesn't want to close. Usually the end of a verse is supposed to build up energy toward the chorus, but here he seems to explicitly reject that, taking the energy built by the rising lines and very definitively resolving it, even anticipating the last note by a 16th in order to make sure he gets there before the verse ends. If I wanted to read some sort of narrative meaning into this, and come on, you know I do, I'd say it feels like he's disconnecting from his partner here, as represented in the lyrics by his inability to dance. A big, dramatic buildup conveys a sense of rising passion, but that's not what's happening. He's watching that passion die in real time, and the melody unwinds to let it go. But it's not like the chorus is a complete nothing burger. The same basic arrangement continues, but there's a couple new elements. Most notably, the piano sound changes, with a different electric piano setting, and also what sounds like a string patch layered in. This creates a richer, more lush harmonic bed to support the addition of some extra vocal layers doubling the melody. I'm never gonna dance again. And those voices also picked up a bunch of reverb, making them feel more distant than the relatively intimate delivery of the verse. I'm sure you know by now what I'm gonna say that choice represents. Melodically, he jumps up an octave and drops a lot of the flourishes, exposing the core pattern much more clearly. And it is, again, a walk down the scale, but this time with a smaller range. The target is still D, but instead of starting on A, the 5th, he only goes up to F, the minor 3rd. I'm never gonna dance again. The smaller range, along with a greater emphasis on that minor interval, makes him feel helpless and defeated, even as the higher register makes him more emotional. Taken together, it sounds like he's pleading for another chance, even as the lyrics make it clear he knows he won't get one. After the chorus, the band keeps going, and we get this lovely little tag on an acoustic guitar by Andrew Ridgeley. It's a really interesting contrast to the blaring saxophone from the intro. Ridgeley's line is much less structured than Gregory's, mostly playing around in that same D-F space as the chorus melody, starting low before transitioning up to the higher register to close out the phrase. It's a lovely choice, and the soft, gentle sound of the acoustic contrasts beautifully with the complex, artificial timbre of the electric pianos. Moving on to the second verse, I want to highlight a really interesting melodic choice. Michael starts high, maintaining a bit of the chorus register, and then on the second line, he blends both figures together, first walking from high F to D, then dropping to A and walking down to a low D. Careless whispers of a good friend. Given how similar the sections are in many ways, this feels really fitting, blurring the lines between them to turn it into one continuous story. This verse also features some extra flourishes from Ridgeley and Estes, although actually Estes started doing that in the chorus, I just forgot to mention it. Point is, the looping structure is starting to open up to more ad-libbing from the band members now that we're far enough in to have gotten the point. We see even more of that in the second chorus, with Michael adding in some ad-libbed responses to his main vocal line, after which, 2 minutes into the song, we finally see the triumphant return of the saxophone. In principle, this is still playing the exact same thing, but it feels much larger thanks to the more complex accompaniment. The song has been subtly building in new layers as it goes, and while none of them stand out too much on their own, the accumulation of all of them over multiple minutes has created a significantly more dynamic texture than the last time we heard this line. But oh my god, this video is getting so long, and I already spent like 10 minutes talking about this saxophone. Let's just skip ahead to the bridge. Here, a couple things happen. Most prominent to my ears is the addition of yet another keyboard sound, this time a brass synth that plays a stab on beat 2 of each bar. Or not actually each bar. They do this for the D and G chords and then stop for the back half of the loop. I think this is to leave space for the melody, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The other big change is the addition of a new guitar part, layered behind the first one, playing this little pentatonic pattern with the same cross-rhythmic accents as Burns' earlier part that doesn't change as the chords do. I don't have a lot to say about it specifically, but the existence of a new part here with its own identity, not bound to the overall pattern that came before it, does help define the formal boundaries that make this an effective bridge. And speaking of formal boundaries, a lot of that work is also done by Murrell, who sets the section up with a huge drum fill. Actually, he's been doing a lot of those throughout the song, marking the end of each 4-bar phrase with fills that get bigger and more impactful to match the song's rising energy. If you go back and listen through, you can really hear the fills develop as the song does. It's subtle, but cool. Vocally, he's even higher here, but more importantly, his delivery has changed. In the high parts of the chorus, he faded off to a softer tone, but here he's basically belting, adding a deep sense of despair as he comes to terms with the full weight of his actions.
Tonight the music seems so loud.
Melodically, it again seems largely bounded by A and D calling to mind the verse, but the walkdown is inconsistent and incomplete. The end of the bridge has him leap up even higher and flip into a full-on falsetto,
But who's gonna dance with me?
which in these sorts of songs is kinda like the vocal tech equivalent of bursting into tears. The emotions of the piece come to a head, and he can no longer hold them back. There's also an interesting parallel with the saxophone line. The notes are completely different, but if we look at the start of the melody,
Tonight the music seems so loud.
it's that same syncopated 16th note rhythm with the same downward contour that jumps back up halfway through. And since this part follows directly from that line, it's easy to hear it as a continuation of that structure, developing it in new ways and finally putting words to the pain of that melody. It's different enough to not sound predictable, and he does move away from that pattern later in the section, but the initial similarity gives it a beautifully subtle cohesion with the musical identity of the rest of the song. That leads into the third chorus, which is, again, even bigger. There's some added harmony vocals,
Guilty feet have got no rhythm.
and Estes is going absolutely nuts. After which the saxophone comes back for a third time, then the band vamps for a bit while Michael does more vocal ad-libs, before finally fading out. And that's pretty much it. I knew going in that I was gonna have to spend a bunch of time talking about the saxophone, and yeah, that's why I wanted to do this song. It's a fantastic sax part. But beyond that, Careless Whisper is also a really interesting case study in the power of musical layers. The basic structure is just one 4-bar loop played forever, but by slowly adding new parts and expanding old ones, it keeps a powerful sense of momentum without needing any obvious textural changes. The build is slow and subtle, and sometimes it doesn't feel like you're going anywhere at all, but the end result is still extremely satisfying, and I think that's really impressive. So yeah, thanks for watching. I really wasn't sure what I was going to get into with this one. I knew I was going to have a really long section about the saxophone. I didn't realize it was going to get quite that long, but it turned out there was a lot to say. As always, I really want to thank my Patreon patrons who make all these videos possible. I absolutely could not do this without your support. I especially want to thank my featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff, all of whom have been extremely generous, so seriously, thank you. I feel like I should be using this outro section to update you all on what I've been working on, but really I've mostly just been working on videos. I have some merch stuff that I was starting the process of. I don't want to put too much out there before we've really nailed down final plans and everything, but there will be hopefully some news on that soon. We are hitting some snags, but it's a complicated process, but hopefully should be good to go soon. We'll definitely update you on that once I have everything in place. In the meantime, there is some other merch stuff that I already have in my store. There's a sticker pack if you're interested in that. We also have some enamel pins of elephants that I don't think I ever actually announced, but those have been in the store for a little while. There's a link to that in the description if anyone wants pins that have elephants on them. We have two different colors. There's a silver and a gold one. They're facing opposite directions, so you can pin them and have them look at each other. It's cute. I thought it was cute. You might not think it's cute. You probably think it's cute. I'm right. What am I talking about? This is even more rambly than usual for these outros. I'm not even sure what the point of this section is. Mostly, I just wanted to have an outro that was a little less formal and a little less structured so I could talk a bit about, like, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, communicate my vision. That sounds so pretentious. That's fine. I am who I am. Yeah. That's a weird note to end on, but that's the note I'm going to end on. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rocking. Yep. That's how this video is going to end.